I'd like to begin the evening by acknowledging the original inhabitants of the land and waters we meet upon, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Robert's visit has been supported by the Australia Council, the Australian Government's arts funding and advisory body. So we'd like to acknowledge their support for the arts in Australia, and I'd like to congratulate particularly Anna Waldman for all her help both with tonight and also with the Biennale and Dialogues Forum. Robert is currently Dean of the Yale School of Art and a consulting curator of modern and contemporary art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He was the director of the 52nd International Art Exhibition, La Biennale di Venezia, in 2007, and curator of the 5th International Biennial at Site Santa Fe in 2004. From 1990 to 2002, he was curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, where he organized what I have to say is one of my all-time favorite shows, a solo exhibition of the work of Gerhard Richter, a catalogue that has pride of place in my bookcase, as I know it has in that of many curators across the world. He's curated many, many memorable exhibitions, written dozens of monographs and catalogues, and we're very proud to have him here tonight. He's also contributing editor at Art in America since 1981 and writes for Art Forum, Parquet, Art Press Paris and Frieze in London. He's written articles on Polka, on Elizabeth Murray, Francesco Clementi, Bryce Marden, Leon Golub and Yvonne Reiner, among others. And his articles on the problems of public art criticism and the global art community have appeared there since 1982. He's received many, many honours, including a Penny McCall Foundation grant for painting, a Norton Family Foundation curator grant, and I think I probably won't go through them all. There are too many to mention. So I'd like to thank Robert. I'm really thrilled to have him here. I said to him earlier today that the last time he spoke here, I think maybe even 2 years ago, his lecture is undoubtedly one of the highlights that we've ever had in this museum, and I'm really delighted to have him back again to talk to us tonight, I think, about some of the problems of biennales. Thank you.
Before I do what I'm supposed to be here to do, I'd like to do some thanks. I have many Australian friends that I have made here, traveled with elsewhere, and so on, but tonight I'm going to limit it to 3, and they share the same name and 2 of them the same hair color. So I would like to thank 3 Anns, one Anna. Liz Ann McGregor, Ann Lewis, and Anna Waldman. And Anna Waldman was in particular a very great help with the Venice Biennale and very great help in getting Australian artists there in force, and you will see a little bit of that tonight. Otherwise, I'll tell you what the slides are going to be about, and I will now do the first. The slides are a mishmash. This actually is a view of the Whitney Biennial of 2006, a collaborative project of Ricoeur Venetia and of blanking now, terrible. Marc de Souver, which involved paintings made about the war ongoing in the Middle East by a host of artists of all different generations and types. There will come in the middle a group of images of Ellsworth Kelly talking to a lot of different other artists. I have them courtesy of Ellsworth's partner, Jack Shear, who's a very good photographer. You'll see a jump in quality of the photographs immediately. And that is about the dialogue between Ellsworth and these different artists. One could easily have done the same thing with other artists had they been equipped with a good photographer as a companion. And I think by the time you've seen a bunch of these, and they'll just sort of roll like wallpaper, you will understand that they are there not for the work, but in fact for the human dynamics between work and between or among people. I'm also going to try and, in a sense, cover a little bit of what was done by the conference that we just had, thanks to Anna. And I would like to acknowledge the colleagues who were at it, who confirmed some feelings that I had, gave me some ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I say not as an original thought so much, but just as a thought, or several thoughts. I'll talk, you'll listen. You'll talk, I'll listen. I'll talk, they'll listen. They'll talk, I'll listen. You talk, they'll listen. They'll talk, you'll listen. We'll talk, they'll listen. They'll talk, we'll listen. You'll talk, they'll listen. They'll talk, you'll listen. I'll talk, they'll listen. They'll talk, I'll listen. I'll talk, you'll listen. You'll talk, I'll listen. With apologies to Bruce Nauman, that is the text of the first version of World Peace. And it seemed to me an appropriate way to start out a discussion about dialogues. Before addressing biennales in particular as a form of dialogue, and also as a problematic form for certain kinds of dialogues, interestingly problematic and also frustratingly problematic, I'd like to sort of go through a series of arguments and thoughts about the idea of dialogue itself. It is a word that we hear a great deal. It is a validating concept evoked in virtually every sector of modern democratic society, and it is also evoked in those which are not democratic, and in such situations the word is the only form in which dialogue appears, but it is often very stressed in a rhetorical sense because of its actual absence in real social discourse. Dialogue is in fact a mode of social discourse. It is also therefore an ideological term. It stands for the principle of participation and of consultation and of feedback and of engagement with those who have different views, different positions, different identities, different backgrounds. It stands for openness, for respect, for reciprocity, and mutuality. It is also a process. By means of dialogue, consensus is built. By means of dialogue, meaning itself is made. This is true in philosophy and literature and has been really since the beginning of Western tradition. From Plato, with a few leaps, to Diderot, with some more leaps to Oscar Wilde, with still more leaps to Mikhail Bakhtin. With Plato, Diderot, and Wilde, conversation is a decidedly, or dialogue, is a decidedly one-sided affair, however. It is essentially a pedagogical exercise. A wise man, the philosopher or the wit, or the thinker, or what have you, or very often the cynic, a wise man enters into a conversation with somebody less wise, and the person less wise primes the wise person to say intelligent, clever, penetrating things. In that case, the wise man's interlocutor is essentially a surrogate for the reader. The reader is in conversation with the wise man, but is understood to be a very junior partner. In fact, not really a partner at all, but simply a foil, a kind of straight man for the wisdom or the wit of the other part of the dialogue. At worst, this kind of thing at best, this kind of thing produces a very interesting way to throw one's voice, to project multiple identities for the writer, and for the writer to talk back to himself or talk back to imagined adversaries. At worst, it is simply another form of monologue, in which case the interlocutor is simply a prompter, there to also be perhaps the beard. True dialogue can only exist where difference is dynamic and where power is divided. Only where something can happen that escapes the intentions of both parties. This, by the way, is the Biennale in Belgrade 2 years ago. Or in the case of multi-sided dialogue of all parties. Now, at the risk of being pedantic, I'd like to go a little further in this direction by raising the issue of the so-called death of the author. This is a concept well known to most people who read critical theory and secondhand to people who read art criticism where it's been picked up, and it is the idea and the phrase of Roland Barthes. It was intended as a way, or the concept was intended as a way, of shifting the power relations from the creation and the creator to reception and the reader. It was specifically aimed at a type of critical theory long dominant in France and influential elsewhere, according to which the purpose of reading was to figure out what the writer meant, to find out what their true intentions, their true substance, their true being was in the text. And there were many strategies for doing this. There was the new criticism where you only read the text. There was Freudian criticism where you read about the psychological makeup of the writer. There was political and social criticism where you read the biography and social history surrounding it. There were all kinds of different variations, and they, of course, disputed each other all the time. But the purpose of understanding what the work was to figure out what, again, the writer meant. Now, Barthes set himself the task of inverting that relationship so that the burden of responsibility shifted away from the author, and also not just the burden of responsibility, but the sources of pleasure in reading, from the genius more or less exalted towards the reader, on the other hand. Over time, this has caused no small number of unforeseen problems and situations, because it has bred, in fact, a class of professional readers. People who are, to use Orwell's formulation, a little more equal than others as readers, or viewers, because we will shift pretty soon to visual culture. Superior, in effect, to what Virginia Woolf called once the common reader, by which she meant the person who has books but is not a student or a professional in letters, a person who reads catch as catch can according to inclination and desire, and otherwise is highly literate but not systematic and with no pretensions. Now, given their profession and the particular place they occupy in what the famous Frankfurt School theoretician Theodor Adorno called the culture industry, and which Charles Baudelaire, who I actually prefer, called the factories of academe, these readers are also writers of essays, commentaries, and treatises. Now, naturally, Barth, who was supremely witty as well as being supremely smart, fully understood the contradictions inherent in the doubling of roles, of going from the position of being the writer who advocates for the reader in order to actually advocate for himself as a writer, and around it goes. And he played this game of the death of the author in ways which were remarkably revealing and remarkably liberating for those people who understood that it was a game. Others who took his idea of the death of the author too literally, and by the way, some of them like to jump up and down on the corpse of genius, they don't just like to sort of set it aside, spawned a whole body of literary criticism which has been, as I say, highly influential in the present art context, and daunting. The most prominent of these writers were, first of all, Barth himself, and others who followed more or less in his footsteps or cut parallel paths, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, Julie Kristeva, and many others. They are people who shared certain premises and who shared certain ideas, and in disagreeing with one another expanded the field of this idea that essentially understanding art and making meaning resides primarily with the reader/viewer. But of course, each one of them in turn generated their own discourse, became their own master thinker, and created a whole host of acolytes and disciples. I, by the way, have just uttered the dreaded word master, since, of course, as you kill the genius, you must also kill the master. We don't like masters around anymore. We don't like to think, actually, that we're devotees of some kind of intellectual guru. But the evidence of footnotes in texts in our magazines and in our catalogs tells you there really are a lot of masters out there, because basically what a master is the person you go to when you can't say something on your own authority, you need somebody else's. One must also assume that in such circumstances, the reader-writer's voice is trumping that of all other readers, some of whom may not be writers at all. And therefore, again, we have the status of a little bit more equal than other readers. Under such circumstances, actual dialogue becomes extremely difficult, because the assumption is that there's already agreement on many, many principles, and anybody who doesn't agree on that principle is cut out of the conversation, which is to say that the so-called dialogue really hasn't happened. We are in Dakar, at Dakar in 2006, one of the African biennales, which is still functioning and still very lively. Which is to say that the whole business of reading becomes ideological. It becomes a matter of signing up for which club you want to be in order to carry on your part of a dialogue, which is really not a dialogue, but a chorus monologue. Or at least at the worst case scenario, it can be like that. Now, with this rough sketch in mind, I would like to turn to the question of biennials and the possibilities of dialogue among them, as well as to the potential, too often thwarted by a variety of factors, of dialogues within them. For dialogue to exist, two conditions are essential: roughly equivalent access to information, direct access to the others with whom one is in dialogue. Speaking then of a dialogue of biennials only makes sense if one is speaking of people who are lucky enough to go to several over the course of a season or a couple of seasons, and as a consequence be in a position to exchange responses and ideas. De facto, this means art professionals, art collectors, or amateurs. people with resources and opportunities to travel and time to allocate to their interest in art in this particular form. Now, of course, I'm one of those people, so I'm not going to be a self-hating, disingenuous member of my social stratum or of my profession. I'm simply noting that there is, in fact, a relatively, in fact, extremely small number of us who do this on any kind of regular basis. So if I challenge the notion that a dialogue of biennales can truly be based on conversation within this select company, it is not because I automatically want to disparage any member or group within it. This is still Dakar, still Dakar, still Dakar. Unlike some of my colleagues, I do not think all collectors are to be disdained, nor all dealers, nor all financially successful artists, nor all museum curators. I am in fact repeatedly dismayed when I see people who work constantly with members of all those different groups, but then publish opinions that suggest that they know none of them, have no debts to any of them, don't have easy social relations, and in fact don't sup at the table of just about every one of them. I do not pretend to be shocked neither am I shocked when art and commerce meet. The notion that art and commerce are separate, have ever been historical separate, is a complete and total fiction that serves only those who like to live by fictions. Van Gogh's brother was an art dealer. The fact that Van Gogh did not sell any paintings was not for lack of trying. Rembrandt and other artists were extremely successful financially, and so on down the line. The myth that we now have that there is this world over here of tainted money and a world over here of pure art, and that critical theory is there to create a prophylactic separation between the two is, again, as I say, just a fiction. How one behaves, more or less ethically, in this relationship is very important, but that there is a relationship and that everybody is complicitous and everybody is involved who is otherwise seriously involved with art, it seems to me, is indisputable. I'll just skip that, I've more or less said it. Still, dialogue among biennales centered on the nomadic gatherings of the happy few is of limited cultural significance. The significance that it has, basically, is that the members of that happy few become more exquisite in their judgments, and in a positive sense, sometimes more competitive. In other words, having seen a lot of things, they don't wish to repeat what somebody else has done or do it less well than somebody they know is much more talented in a particular way of doing that they have also been inclined to try but now realize is not for them. One might make the case that a larger and more diverse number could be added to this group, this happy few, by the dissemination of catalogs and internet documentation and criticism. But in many cases, this assumes that the wider audience such things ostensibly seek or provide for is well served by what is actually on offer. Is this true? This, by the way, is still in Dakar, and I will now jump. This is a model for the Venice Biennale. This is the white cube in miniature. You can see a white cube in miniature with an anticipated viewer right through the door. Henceforth, you will see actual viewers, as you've already been looking at actual viewers in other Biennale situations. Some actual viewers looking at Elizabeth Moran. As I said, one might consider that this happy few is expanded by the number of people who have access to all these different forms of documentation, catalogs, internet criticism. Are exhibition catalogs currently written for Virginia Woolf's common reader, or are they written for the specialized readers who are already signed on to the discourses that they take for granted? Are they, in fact, just another subset of the happy few? And I'll make a point, by the way, here. It is not necessarily true that sophisticated ideas come in opaque prose. In fact, great and clear ideas come generally in great and clear prose. Of art writers that I have known and admired, Meyer Shapiro and Leo Steinberg, both are wonderful prose stylists. The notion that they write in a way which is less sophisticated than somebody who writes, again, in the sort of standard jargon art talk of the moment is utter nonsense. But if they do this, then one should not simply make special exceptions for them. You know, painting is dead except there's Ryman and, Gerhard Richter. Art has to be complicated on the page except that there's Leo Steinberg and Meyer Shapiro. The truth of the matter is that there are many clear, lucid writers about art but they are not treated as being the peers of those who write less clearly, less lucidly, because it is assumed that their ideas are not that complicated if they are that clear, or that they are trying to pander to an audience which is incapable of thinking complex thoughts, which is a mistake that Meyer Shapiro and Leo Steinberg never made. Now, is the internet documentation accurate verbally or visually? Is criticism in newspapers sufficiently descriptive to allow the reader to get a reliable sense of what was in the show before assessing the critic's opinions? These answers to these leading questions are, to too large an extent, fairly obvious. It is a series of no's. The exceptions are too few to make it possible to imagine a wider audience capable of entering into dialogue about the works in most exhibitions or the structure and textures of their presentation in any optimistic way. I will not dwell on how this played out in Venice, but I think if you read reviews of almost any of these shows, and Carolyn has gotten a couple of them already, you will understand the degree to which criticism actually is not criticism at all. It is raw opinion foisted off on something that actually had contents that would require a more intelligent, more complex response. In other words, the opinion is pre-cooked, and the show is the occasion to deliver it to the reader, rather than there being, again, a dialogue between the critic, who may or may not like what they see, but an actual dialogue about what's in front of both the viewer and the critic and the reader of the text. The question is whether the reader is treated as if they are already part of the dialogue, or as if they have to pass some exceptional test in order to merit inclusion in this conversation. I would add, by the way, that this really is a problem of criticism, not of the art. I don't know any serious major artist who is playing as hard to get as the people who write about them on a regular basis who do have this tendency. Most of the artists that I know, and they make work which is indeed very difficult and very daunting, nonetheless want to get through to the people that are out there who might understand about what makes their work that way, why they think it is necessary to make it that way, and what it is ultimately that they wish to convey, illuminate, say, express, or what have you. Now, under those circumstances, if you cannot rely on the secondary presentations, you have to assume that in order to participate in this kind of visual culture, the viewer must actually be just that, a viewer. They must be physically present in the space of the exhibition and in the presence of objects. Without that, they are so terribly disadvantaged that they cannot really do it, and as long-distance eavesdroppers or spectators, they become long-distance eavesdroppers or spectators to a dialogue and a discourse that are going on elsewhere. There is another key concept here, which has often been misrepresented in tangentious criticism, and that is the concept of aura, introduced by Walter Benjamin, colleague of Theodor Adorno, who wrote a famous article called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which is one of those things you find footnoted over and over and over again. It is often used in contemporary criticism as if to say that at last the aura, the suspect glamour, the suspect sacredness of the art object is gone and behind us. We have entered into the grand new age when finally we are dealing with works of art which could be reproduced en masse, which have lost their monetary value, or their specialness at least in monetary terms, which have lost their quasi-religious overtones and so on. And that's the way the concept is used. It's not actually what Benjamin said at all. And if he did say that loss of aura was a factor now in the modern age, he regretted it rather than celebrated it. Now, aura was something else. For him, aura meant the product of the unique encounter of an individual viewer with an individual work of art at a precise place in a precise period of time. That aura is what happens when there is a dialogue, basically an active dialogue between the viewer and the work of art. And that aura is not a magical thing, it is a creation. It is precisely the point at which the viewer/reader makes meaning themselves out of what is in front of them. And that meaning is necessarily contingent on all these other factors, which means that it is not definitive, which means there's lots in play, and it is very, very interesting when that process takes place in the presence of other viewers who are arriving at other conclusions, in which case then viewers in the presence of the object and in each other's presence can disagree and can have different experiences. And aura then becomes not a sort of nimbus of contemplation, but a charged atmosphere of potential disagreement. Okay, the sum of these observations lead me to a conclusion that calls into the question the premise of this conference to a certain degree. And if I offer them this way, it is without any attempt to denigrate the good intentions behind the conference, but to simply say that I think under some of the conditions that I've tried to sketch, this is, by the way, the opening of the Biennale. I'll give you some more. That it seems that the conditions applied means that, actually speaking, there cannot be a dialogue among biennales. It is not because we have too many, by the way, and it is not that I feel, as some of my colleagues do, although I think a few of them feel this sort of urgently and with great enthusiasm, they feel it with a kind of sense of discontent. Vassif Kortun, for example, was quoted several times in the piece that he wrote that in this conference we just had about thinking that maybe the work of biennales is over with, but I know what the sort of travails Vassif has gone through to do the Istanbul Biennale and others. I don't blame him a bit for being depressed and for feeling somewhat as if maybe this isn't worth the effort, and I think any of us who have done more than one often feel the same way. But in fact, I would like to make a case that biennales are in fact very necessary, and in fact the only conditions in which aura, again not the mystical kind but the direct kind, can become, to all intents and purposes, democratic. There are probably more biennales than the economies of the countries involved and the cities involved can sustain, and there will be probably some terrible reckoning at a certain point. We will lose a number of them. Once upon a time there was Venice, then there was the Carnegie International, and then we waited 50 years and there was a Sao Paulo Biennale, and then we waited about 20 years and there were a spate of new ones, and then all of a sudden we were past 100. This kind of bubble economy of biennales cannot last. But I would like to argue that the bubble economy of biennales is one bubble I kind of like. And the question is how to preserve the best of them under circumstances that may not be so favorable to them.